We're going to read a text by Susan Hayden-Elding, The Construction Lardon. That dates back to 88 and is a dictionary of a language she invented called First Dictionary and Grammar of Lardon. It was translated in 2020 by Colleen Chine and Shanmaze, published on their blog called Future, and who gave us the authorization to publish their translation of the text in our reader, the yellow one. I quote, "In the fall of 81, I was involved in several seemingly unrelated activities. I had been asked to write a scholarly review of the book Women and Men Speaking by Cherise Kramer. I was working on a speech for the WisCon Science Fiction Convention scheduled for March of 1982, and I was reading and rereading Douglas Hofstadter's Gödel, Escher, Bach. I had also been reading a series of papers by Cecil Brown and his associate on the subject of lexicalization, i.e. The giving of names, words in the most cases, or parts of words, to units of meaning in human languages. Out of this serendipitous mix came a number of things. I became aware, through Kramer's book, of the feminist hypothesis that existing human languages are inadequate to express the perceptions of women. This intrigued me because it had a built-in paradox. If it is true, the only mechanism available to women for discussing the problem is the very same languages alleged to be inadequate for the purpose. Then occurred to me an interesting possibility within the framework of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, briefly that language structures perceptions. If women had a language adequate to express the perceptions, it might reflect a quite different reality than that perceived by men. This idea was reinforced for me by the papers of Brown et al., in which there was a constant reference to various phenomena of lexicalization as the only natural and self-evident possibilities. I kept thinking that women would have done it differently, and that what was being called the quote-unquote natural way to create words seemed to be instead the male way to create words. I read in Gödel, Escher, Bach a reformulation of Gödel's theorem, in which Hofstadter proposed that for every record player there were records it could not play, because they would lead to its indirect self-destruction. And it struck me that if you square this, you would get a hypothesis for every language. There were perceptions it could not express because they would lead to their indirect self-destruction. Furthermore, if you cubed it, you could get a hypothesis that for every culture, there were languages it could not use because they would lead to its indirect self-destruction. This made you wonder what would happen to American culture if women have and did use a language that expressed their perception. Would it self-destruct? I focused my guest of honor speech for WisCon on the question of why women portraying new realities in science fiction had, so far as I know, dealt only with matriarchy and androgyny, and never with a third alternative based on the hypothesis that women are not superior to men, matriarchy, or interchangeable with and equal to men, androgyny, but rather entirely different from men. I proposed that it was at least possible that this was because the only language available to women excluded the third reality. Somewhere along the way, it all fell together me, and I found myself with a cognitive rule much too fascinating to ignore. I chose as a medium for writing of a science fiction novel about the future American in which the woman language was being constructed as it was used. After some time, all of this fell together, and I found myself with a cognitive mixture that was too beguiling to ignore. The only thing was to figure out how I was going to explore all of this. A scientific analysis and a publication required a lot of financing, and I didn't have the funds that would allow me to ignore this aspect of the problem. So I chose as a medium to write a science fiction novel in future America in which the language of women was to be used. And this book called Native Tongue was published by Doe Books in August of 1984. Native Tongue 2 by Judith Rose was published by Doe in February 1987. In order to write the book, I felt obligated to at least try and construct the language. I'm not an engineer, and when I write about engines, I make no attempt to pretend that I know how engines are put together or how they function. But I'm a linguist, and knowing how languages work is supposed to be my home territory. I didn't feel that I could ethically just fake the woman language or just insert a handful of hypothetical words and phrases to represent it. I needed at least the basic grammar and a modest vocabulary, and I needed to experience what such a project would look like. I therefore began on June 28, 1982, the construction of the language that became Lada. And because I am a linguist, I studied many existing languages based on a family of existing languages, and to build Lada, to construct Lada, and I try to use the characteristics of these languages that seemed appropriate to me. This method of construction is often called patchwork, and is not very well considered by the patriarchal paradigm that dominates contemporary science. Allow me to remind you that patchwork amongst women is considered as a form of art, and that its methodology is very respected. My original goal was to reach a vocabulary of 1,000 words, enough, if well chosen, for ordinary conversation and informal writing. I passed that objective early on, and in the fall of 1982, the journal Women and Language News published the first writing in the language of a nativity written from Mary's point of view. There was another factor that involved my idea to build Iodine. It was developed from the work I was conducting. I find myself discussing the idea of a language of women, trying to explain the need for this new language in meetings and in conferences with my friends and colleagues. And it appeared to me that with a bit of patience, it was possible to get the concepts across. There was, for example, the concrete case that there is in English no word for what a woman does during sexual intercourse. And this allowed me to clarify a few points. But I was tired of questions and answers. People would ask me, if human languages, the existing ones, are inadequate to express human feelings, why never did they invent a language that was appropriate? And I did not know the answer. It became fastidious and frustrating. And it was a relief for me because at last I could say, well, it so happens that a woman constructed such a language as of June 1982, and the language is called Lardon. This book is a grammar manual of Latin that comes along with a dictionary, and as far as I know, it's the beginning of a failure, something that will be of no interest to anybody but a collector of exotic specificities. And because the book exists, it will be difficult to lose Latin, or like others, languages were engulfed in the history of humankind. And for that, I'm very grateful to the members of SSFR3 to consider it as important to justify its publication. Susan Helding, Alabama. Thank you.
Alors, on va lire un deuxième texte qui est une lettre.
I'm going to give you a second reading, which is a letter by Johanna Ross that was written to James Tripp Jr. James Tiptree is an author who until 1976 used this pseudonym and who in reality was a woman, Alice Sheldon. This woman was also an art critic who worked for the CIA and a fascinating figure, and who was also a pilot. Now, this is the letter Johanna Ross wrote to James Tiptree. Dear Tip, sorry about the Phil Dick correspondence, but I don't have a copy of my original letter, which was to John Brunner. I don't know if it got into a vector at all. Phil wrote an angry letter to Brunner, which Brunner sent to me. And then I wrote Phil a long, earnest, detailed letter telling him how wise it was, except for this, and we've been friends ever since. Except that I just did get to read his whole speech and cavilled a bit at this woman who endures everything bit, which is nonsense. I told him I couldn't have endured what he'd gone through, and it's true. Anyway, I'm sorry. I just don't have either. What I jibbed at in Phil Dick's speech was the sewing machine business, and that obligatory is stale, awful business. If it was a man rapes a sewing machine, it had better be a female sewing machine, and then goes off into a long, elaborated picture of silly female sewing machines having their hair done, etc., gossiping and so on. The odd combination of fear and curiosity masked by nervous prurience, with which so many men joke in public about women, has always annoyed me. And I think I was rather vicious about it. But anyway, since I decided that one must give sexist pigs at least one chance to prove they're human, and then if they don't, I write a second letter in which I crush them with my hobnail boots. Nobody else has responded the way Dick did. Apparently, he really sat down and thought about it, but the letter I wrote to him is private, and I would send it to a carbon if it. But if it's fairly simple, I just said that he was old and wise in some things, and I'd learned from him. But that in this case, I was old and wise. I'd been thinking about the topic for years, and quoted a bit from Michael Korda's Male Chauvinism book about how every anti-Semitic joke is joining hands with the Nazis, however, unconsciously, and so on. The obligatory "I'm not queer" bit, let's hope it's a female sewing machine, really depressed me. I can only imagine what loathsome tangles of motivation it covers. None of them homosexual, I would think. And it's so like the 50s. I'm not a communist, but stuff. You know, the ritual disclaimer of ultimate evil. And I get very angry for a great many friends of mine at that point. And there was something else by somebody else in the damn magazine about somebody's wife cheating on the yogurt money that also teed me off. It's the thing people do thoughtlessly. It's the things that people do thoughtlessly that are bad. Recently, in Lucas Charles Platt wrote about the dispossessed, the physicist hero's love for the plain and homely wife, and I wrote in Identifying Husband by Profession and Wife, and geez, he loves her and she isn't even beautiful, is another thoughtless sexist gassiness. Pat wrote back and said I was too sensitive. Takver, the figure in the book, was ugly. And why didn't I pick on Rossler? Because his own personal relations with his women friends were spotless. And he is all for feminists, provided he doesn't deteriorate into silly nitpicking. In other words, I thought I should go bother somebody else, and then wrote him a long, earnest letter about how I learned as a little girl that men were professionals and women wives, and that pretty plain is a calculus. Every woman is crushed practically from birth up, and he didn't think so, trying to say, "Oh, what a pretty little boy you are," to somebody 3-year-old. He'd probably call the police and so on, addressing him as if he were a saint, of course, and that public statements reach many more people than his exemplary private life. I did groan over his statement in the letter that he had no sexist prejudices. I said that if he didn't know we all had them, he was hopeless. I shouldn't write to everybody like that, but it bothers me unless I do. And from what is in The Dispossessed, I'm afraid the whole Charles Platt fell into what was partly dug up by Ursula Le Guin, who was some sort of horrible classic tragedy as a woman artist. She obviously can write very, very well at times, but she never writes about herself or from her own center because she can't imagine a woman doing anything in the world. So we get this half-written, half-taught books in which you can see her compensating for her lack of direct knowledge. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but it always gives the book a sort of strained heaviness, and sometimes just going wildly off the beam as in depicting public life, unless it's exotic or mythic. I raved about the dispossessed for days until I finally wrote the review. Just sent off to FNSF. No, don't ask me for a copy. It'll come out sometime in the fall. By the way, Carol M. Schwiller's Join Our Cause, lousy title, by the way, is some kind of bloody masterpiece. It's positively amazing. She never touches big quote-unquote subjects and firmly sticks to what she knows and nothing else. And the result is just cut to the bone. I'll resist the temptation to quote, but you should run right out and buy it at Harper & Row. It's not a feminist book, though the publishers have made it made a half-hearted attempt to make it look that way, and the last story in it should be Peninsula, not maybe another long march across China. It's extremely funny and sometimes just plain terrifying. At one point, she writes, she knows what she'll say to the people springing the trap or the sergeant of the firing squad. Wait, I'll say. Philip Dix is idiotic in some ways, and I can't agree with that business about stealing the Coca-Cola. You know, if you're going to gum up the works, do it publicly and invite all the newspapers and TV to be there. But he does seem to be a much harassed, much suffering man. And throw your body in front of the war machine is the kind of thing people say when they're desperate. Like the times I have come muttering, kill them all, under my breath, I guess so. I'm trying to be charitable. I guess you guys mess things up. It doesn't bother me so much. But when a woman, especially as intelligent, cultivated, talented woman like Ursula does, so I heard. Susie Charles's book, infinitely less good and less subtle, nonetheless has about 10 light years on Ursula simply because China knows. She doesn't make that particular middle-class error of thinking homosexuals are asexual, or that love conquers all, or that a woman couldn't do what she wanted even if she set her mind to it. She's really a great type of female person, and just she has been places and known people Ursula knows nothing about. I keep harping on the homosexuality thing in Dispossessed because it sticks out like a sore thumb so hardly. It's typical of so much else. The economics of AIO had my head swimming. Here is capitalism, which mustn't expand. That's the law of its being. And yet they have a stable population, a sound ecological conservation program, and no depressions. And the women who have 2 children apiece take no part in public life at all. They're all housewives and society ladies, and her slum is so impossible for a modern city that they immediately located it in the 19th century Russian fiction. If you read Walk to the End of the World, you'll see how crude it is in comparison to anything of Ursula's later stuff. And yet, it's all there. She's writing a sequel about the women who do escape and what kind of society they form. I'm trying to avoid eye strain, a hopeless undertaking for a long weekend like this, and wondering when I should begin job letters and so wanting, etc. Now that you're back, won't you tell me how you are and what you are doing? Joanna. End of quote. So Ursula and Joanna made it up since. Thank you.